Hello and welcome to another Deprogrammed interview. I am your host, Keri Smith. It's good to be back, and I'm very excited to introduce you guys to my guest today. This is an episode especially for parents. So if you like this show, if you like the interview today, I recommend sharing it with parents who are interested in improving their kids' education, taking control of their kids' education. My guest today is an expert on this. Her name is Hannah Frankman. She's the founder of Rebel Educator, which is a great name. Rebel Educator, and she's the host of the Hannah Frankman Podcast. She grew up homeschooled. She skipped college to start working immediately in the startup world. And she does regularly writes about education innovation. And I'm very excited to talk with her today. Hello, Hannah. Welcome.
Hello, Keri. I'm so excited to be here.
Thank you for being patient with me and getting this set up and my studio renovations and everything. You've been just very cool about it. I appreciate it.
Oh, not a problem at all. Trust me, I'm always balancing like half a dozen different projects, and I would be the worst hypocrite in the world to have any negative feelings about somebody having lots of things going on.
You do appear to have lots of things going on. So I was really lucky to meet you in person. I was invited to an event in Austin. Some people on Twitter were like, "Oh, you should be at this thing." And I'm so glad I went because I wasn't aware of your podcast before. It turns out we know some people in common in the education space, but you are, now correct me if I get this wrong. You're based. Would you call yourself that?
Oh, yeah. Okay. Very much so.
You are based, and you're based here in Texas, and your podcast looks like it's incredibly successful. It's taking off. And then you're also the founder of this organization, Rebel Educator. So you have a lot of things going on right now.
Yeah. And that's only the public facing stuff. There are other projects too. People ask me sometimes at events, like at the event where we met, someone will ask me, "What do you do?" And I have a very hard time summarizing. Sometimes I'll just pick one thing. I'll be like, I'm a writer. Like, I don't know how to explain it all. It's complicated, but life is more fun that way.
It is, definitely. So I want to get into your background. Like, I want to find out who you are. How did you get involved in this space, in the education space? You were homeschooled. Can we start there? Should we?
Yeah, absolutely. I ended up in education totally by accident. I was the kid growing up that wanted to be absolutely everything. Like, I wanted to be a hockey player. I wanted to run a pizza joint. I wanted to be the person who figured out how dolphin like language works. I wanted to be a sports psychologist. I wanted to do everything. And one of the few things that never made it on the list was education commentator. It was just sort of circumstance that brought me here, but it was a very fortuitous series of events. And it starts with my own education. So I grew up homeschooled, like you said. I went to a private Montessori preschool and kindergarten. So I had a somewhat unique, very early education, but then first grade all the way through 12th grade, I was homeschooled. So I don't think I realized until maybe a handful of years ago that, like, I'm in my mid-20s now. I don't think I knew until my mid-20s that my education was really different from what most people experience, and how fundamental that background was in shaping how I understand how the world works and how I engage with the world. I just thought being homeschooled was like kind of cool, and you had to explain it to your grandparents' friends because they didn't understand it, and you had to explain to the lady at the grocery store counter why you were there in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. But besides that, like, I didn't understand that it was that wildly different. But really secretly, I was getting a crash course in education the entire time because I was watching my parents homeschool me, and they were very vocal about their process when I was younger. So I was kind of, watching them think through figuring out what a homeschool education ought to be. And then by the time I got to high school, my education was super self-directed. So I was kind of designing it myself.
Wow.
And because of the background that I had in high school, going to college felt like a huge step backwards because I was already designing my own education, and I was working through college level resources in high school. And so going somewhere where you had to sit through 2 years of gen ed requirements to start working on a bachelor area specialization of some kind, it just felt like such a ridiculous step backwards that
You were
I
bored,
point.
probably too.
So yeah, so I ended up skipping college, and I was just trying to figure out how to be successful without a college degree. And so I ended up reading a bunch of content that was put out by this organization called Praxis, that was a startup apprenticeship program that was helping young people start working in the startup world instead of going to college. And I was just consuming all of their content, and I thought they were really cool, to the point where I was like, I really kind of want to work for these people. So I ended up working for them for a few years, and that's how I ended up in the education space. Like, just following my own path, I discovered, I learned a ton about education along the way. I realized that I had a lot to say
Mhm.
about it. I very slowly realized that my background was very different from the status quo, and that I'd gotten extraordinarily lucky to have that background. And so
Let's
I
talk about
started.
that.
Yeah, please.
So your parents, they both participated in homeschooling you.
Yeah.
And what were their reasons for homeschooling instead of sending you to a public or private school?
There are so many different ways to answer that question.
Yeah.
There were so many reasons. Um, I think fundamentally at the core, my parents, like, depending on the day and depending on which parent you ask, they both will give you different answers. But generally speaking, I was already, because of I was a very accelerated student
Mhm.
at the Montessori school that I went to. Um, I learned to read and write very quickly. I was pretty good at, like, basic arithmetic. I was just, kids develop on different timelines. Doesn't mean that there's anything special or not special about the kid. We're just, like, ready for different things at different points in time. Um, and I was just ready for all of that stuff really quickly. So I already knew all of the things that I would have been learning in first grade in school. And so my parents really didn't see the point in sending me there.
Yeah.
Um, and they also were really worried about my creativity getting stifled. I was a really creative kid. They didn't want me sitting in classrooms being told when I could and couldn't draw on things, and what colors I could and couldn't use, and when I could or couldn't be making up a story versus having to sit still and listen. And I think they said often throughout my homeschooling experience that they didn't want pop culture and my peers raising me. They
Mm.
didn't want me to be a product of whatever happened to be popular at different points in time, and they were pretty worried about that being a symptom of being in public school.
Yeah.
Um, and I think they also, like, I got really bullied when I was in kindergarten, even in this small private school, and I think they were really worried about that carrying over into an elementary school experience, and they wanted to shelter me a bit from that too. So there were a lot of different factors at play, but I think they both independently came to the conclusion, like, we can probably do this at home, and we can probably do it better, at least for the first few years, so we might as well try it.
Right. And they're both obviously very bright.
Mhm.
I can tell because you're very bright as well. So, uh, let's get one of the questions out of the way that people always ask, because I've had our mutual friend on the show, Deb Philman, before, who is a homeschool advocate, and one of the questions that I've gotten anytime I've covered the subject from parents is, um, well, if I decide I want to homeschool, how do the kids socialize, and how important is socializing? So, how would you answer that question? Did you socialize with the kids who were your age?
Yes, and I think the yes and is the, like, really the and is the operative word here. Yes, I socialize with kids my own age, and I was socializing with people of all other ages too.
Mm,
And that is a huge advantage,
yes.
because when you're merely socializing with kids who happened to be born in the same calendar year as you, you're getting an experience that really is not at all like how we interact with people in the real world. And one of the things that makes homeschoolers very remarkably socially adept, I hear people talk about this all the time. They meet homeschooled kids and they're like, wow, this kid is so good at talking to adults. And it's like, yeah, every kid would be if they had the chance, but most kids spend their whole childhoods only experiencing adults as authority figures who have to be listened to or deferred to, not people who you can debate with and have rational conversation with and engage with as a friend. Like my sister and I growing up, we were pen pals with my grandma's friends who were in their 70s and 80s, and we'd exchange letters. And they would tell us about what their life had been like growing up, and we'd talk about like what we were growing in our garden and what projects we were working on, and both parties absolutely loved it. But kids in school don't get to do that. They don't get to talk to adults like peers. They don't get to talk to kids of other ages like peers. And so I was constantly socializing with people in a real world context in the same way that you socialize with people as an adult. Like we'd go to the library and we'd talk to the librarian, and we go to our homeschool group and I would talk to the kids my age, and I'd also like read to the little kids who couldn't read yet. And I'd talk to the kids who were older than me. And sometimes I'd sit outside and I'd talk to the moms. And I learned how to socialize across the whole spectrum. And so I think when people think about homeschoolers not being socialized, like unless you live in the middle of nowhere and you're keeping your kids, like you're all living under a rock together and you're not going out into the real world, your child is going to learn how to socialize. They're going to learn how to socialize in ways that are far less cruel than public school, because public school is a nasty environment and kids are really mean to each other. When you put them in these artificial environments, you get these artificial hierarchies that also don't exist in the real world. Like if somebody's not nice to you in the real world, you just stop talking to them because they're not nice and you're not getting anything from the experience. But when kids are put in environments where they're all the same age and they're all competing against each other for social status and academic status and favor from other people in a very artificially constrained environment where it's just like all a closed loop system, they're going to be much more competitive with each other, much nastier to each other. All of their internal angst and problems they have at home and self-esteem issues, like all of that is bleeding out onto everybody else. And that can be really hurtful for kids to be trapped within. So you're getting a social experience that's much more akin to the real world when you're socializing outside of public school. You're learning how to socialize across a broader range, but you're also not being subjected to all of the things that make public school socialization so notoriously cutthroat. Like we just laugh about it in the pop culture. Everybody's like, oh yeah, Mean Girls. Like it's just a thing that we're okay with. And as someone who is not inside of that environment, I find that very strange that we're just collectively like, yeah, it's just how life works. It's not. It doesn't have to be.
Yeah, it's such a great point. And I've heard you talk about in other interviews about, I like the way you talk about public schools and sort of turning it on its head and illustrating for people how unusual it is. Would you mind talking about that just a little bit for anyone who may not have heard that from you
Oh, of
before?
course. Well, one, it's a very new phenomenon, which I think we often forget. We think of public school as being, it's just the way things are, because within living memory, it is like everybody's grandparents and most of their great grandparents at this point went through the public school system as we know it. So it's just sort of, everybody you've ever met, that's how schooling was done. But when your grandparents were growing up, it's not how their grandparents went to school. Things were different. And for most of human history, it was different. And so this idea that this is just the way things are and the way that they're always supposed to be is really short-sighted. It's when you start looking at the history, it's a blip on the continuum of how we've thought about raising and educating our kids throughout the course of human history. But it's also, when you start thinking about it in terms of environment and structure, it's very strange. We put our kids in these very artificially constructed environments inside of classrooms that, again, are age segregated. There's the only adult interaction that you have is with an adult as an authority figure. And even if you have the nicest teacher in the world and they're incredibly committed to helping build relationships with their students and nurture and support their interests and getting to know them as an individual, the context of the structure that they find themselves in forces some level of authoritarianism, because you have to make sure that the kids are behaving. You have to make sure that they're doing well academically. If they're scoring poorly on their tests, you're responsible for that at the end of the day. So you have this, you're beholden to the constraints of the system as a teacher. So you have to So there are limitations to how you can interact with the kids. But for most kids, even if they have the nicest teachers in the world, the perceived nature of the structure is that the adults are authority figures and you need to be somewhat afraid of them and somewhat deferential to them, or you're going to get in trouble, which is weird too. Because if you follow the trouble you keep getting in trouble and you follow that to its natural conclusion, eventually you just get kicked out of school and then you don't have to be inside of the system anymore. And like, that's the punishment. So it's very weird when you think about it. Like you could just go all in and just get perma suspended and then you don't have to deal with it anymore. But most kids are too agreeable in nature to think through that to that logical conclusion. Plus, there's the pressures of society and the home. And like, there's a lot forcing you to conform to the system as it stands. But throughout most of human history, we've been, how accessible education is across the population has varied with time. But generally speaking, we've existed in a world where people have valued educating their kids. Like, practically speaking, you have to understand how the world works in order to be able to navigate it successfully as an adult. But also, for much of human history, we have understood that there is a value to, like, if you're pursuing human flourishing, not just human survival, you want to be able to engage with the ideas that humans have grappled with across time and tap into this broad web of human knowledge that we all have created throughout history, and to be able to engage with ideas in a meaningful way and draw them back down into the physical reality of how you're living in your life so that you can use them to better your life and to flourish in some capacity. So we've always valued ideas and the exchange of information. But it's a very recent phenomenon that we've done that inside of these, closed system cinder block rooms with fluorescent lighting, and kids like very age segregated, and their movements are controlled by the ringing of bells. And it's like all very dystopian when you think about it. Like, historically,
it's like getting ready for factory life or so,
Well,
like,
it is. When you look at the history, that's exactly what it was. And people on Twitter all the time are like, no, that's just an urban legend. And it's not an urban legend. It's true. We designed, like, the rise of the institutional education system coincides with the rise of industrialism. And it was very intentionally designed as a system where we want to be able to collectively manufacture the right types of inputs into our economic system, inputs being workers. So we want a certain number of farmers, a certain number of truck drivers, a certain number of lathe operators. Like, we need people who can do all of these different things at certain, like, we need a certain rate of them per year in order to keep the whole thing running. And so the education system was intended to feed into that. But in a lot of ways, we live in a post-industrial society. Like, most of us aren't going to work at the factory anymore. Most of us are doing other things. We live in a technologically driven world now. It's very different. A lot of
the factories closed, like, and that our grandparents worked at. And I grew up in a factory town, and it was dead. Now it's a meth town in some ways, because it's just, the factory that everyone worked at closed, the mill. Everything moved overseas, or things are moving overseas. So people aren't going into those kind of jobs anymore.
No. And there's a lot of factors that play to this, right? Like, the manufacturing is going elsewhere. There's questions about, like, will some of it come back here as international relations shift and change? And, that's, up for debate what that's going to look like. But regardless, even with manufacturing, like, even if manufacturing came back here, the labor requirements are very different than they used to be, because we have a level of technology that we didn't have before. Like, you don't need raw manpower for every aspect of your factory anymore. And a lot of what humans can uniquely do is very different, and a lot of it's very tech centric. So we're raising kids for a world that's very different than the one that the school system was designed to prepare them for. So even if we allow that the way the system was designed was functional and benevolent and beneficial for the world that existed when the system was designed, which I would argue that's not the case, but that's a separate question. It is certainly not relevant now.
Wow. So can you talk a little bit about some of the alternatives? So let me just bring up your site. This is a fascinating website for any parents who may be watching. As I mentioned in the intro, Hannah is the founder of Rebel Educator. It says change the way you educate your kids. Learning should be fun, but traditional schools make it feel like a chore. We're here to help you find the best way to educate your kids and set them up to thrive. And you have a whole team of people working with you. You are described as an education innovator. And one of the really interesting things I found out about you is that you started some businesses when you were a kid.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I started my first official business when I was 12. I definitely had minor money-making hustles prior to that, but this was like the first proper operation. I was making and selling these hand-knitted dolls. I had designed my own pattern for these like little like yay big little knitted dolls made of all wool yarn, like really like high quality stuffed with wool. Like little embroidered faces. You could get the hair in different colors. And I had these different outfits that I had also designed knitting patterns for and was making.
Let me just stop you here. You may not know this. We have here at Deprogrammed, a huge portion of our audience are knitters. They are wrong knitters. Yes, 50 of them made this quilt behind me. So ladies, Hannah is a knitter, a knitting designer. I didn't know about that part. We just stumbled on that accidentally. What a pleasant surprise. Okay. Continue.
That's amazing. I'm gonna love it here. Yes, kindred spirits. So I was a pretty avid knitter actually when I was young. When I think I was 7, maybe 8. We took my homeschool co-op that I was part of at the time I think it might have been, I forget if it was the homeschool co-op that contracted someone at the Waldorf school, or if the Waldorf school was offering this knitting class and a bunch of people from my co-op signed up. I don't quite remember like the logistics of how it was structured, but a bunch of my homeschooling friends and I took a knitting class at one of the local Waldorf schools. And
cool.
it was very cool. We made knitted squares. We all could pick like an earthy toned color of yarn, and we knitted a square, and then we like folded it in thirds and sewed it up and stuffed it from the bottom and tied a little like ribbon around the neck, and like I think we embroidered a face or something. It was like a little cat. We like made a tail for it. It was like really simple basic knitting, but we made these little stuffed cats, and that I just loved it. I loved the tactile experience. I loved the process of making something. I loved the sort of minor engineering components that went into figuring out how to make something. Like I'm definitely not really like an engineering brain type person, but for whatever reason, knitting makes a lot of sense to me. So I'm like, oh, I need like these proportions here, and I kind of understand how to do it. And so I would find patterns and start working with them, and then they wouldn't quite do what I wanted them to do. So I'd sort of use them as like a mental framework template to understand like, okay, these are sort of like the mechanics that have to go into making something of roughly this shape. But then I would, like figure out how to do what I wanted to do. And sometimes like I got to a point where I could look, and all of my knitting was like fairly simple. I wasn't making like little tiny cable knit sweaters for the dolls or anything. Like I wasn't that extravagant. But like I could look at something that I had seen, like a picture of something I'd seen someone else knit, and I could be like, oh, I think I can like figure out how to sort of, it's just all about increasing and decreasing in the right places and like choosing the stitch. And it wasn't that like, it made sense to me.
So you made a business out of it.
I made a business out of it. And so I made this doll for my sister, and she started taking it to our homeschool co-op, and the moms were very impressed. And I think in retrospect, probably like they partly actually valued what I was making and wanted it for themselves, and partly just wanted to support the young entrepreneur. But in my mind, it's like, well, they absolutely love what I'm making and they want to buy it for their nieces and their daughters. And so I started getting these orders. And so I made like a whole custom catalog where I had drawings of all the different things that I could make. And I had like different color combos. And I had this like swatch card that I just like would bring the catalog and the swatch card and the dolls to co-op every week. And I just like hustle. I'd be like, oh, you want to buy something? Like, let me walk you through everything. And so I sold a whole bunch of dolls, and then I started selling them like as consignment at the yarn store where I was getting my supplies. And so I was doing this for a while. I had like, it was, I don't actually think I made any money because I spent everything that I made buying more yarn. And it wasn't all, like, a lot of it was for my other projects. It wasn't all getting, like, I would have turned a profit had I only been buying the yarn that I needed, but I definitely wasn't. But like, my mom taught me how to bookkeep. So I had this like really cute little journal, and every time I'd make a sale, I'd write down the order and I'd track like if it had gotten paid and how it had been paid and what all the pieces were and how much everything cost. And then I'd, tally up. Oh, wow, I like had 3 orders and then I bought a bunch of yarn. And then I had 2 orders and then I bought a bunch of yarn.
I think
but it was
some of the ladies in the chat are going to recognize that. They'll be like, yeah, see my stash. I know they have stash competitions. And
I still have a lot of yarn.
Can you tell me, so I heard you talk about this in another interview once, and you were kind of trying to explain this to parents about how many different skills you learn when kids are learning in this way, like learning how to be an entrepreneur, learning how to do something that's going to apply to the real world. And for example, you said you may not have been the biggest fan of math in classes, but you were learning bookkeeping and things like that with your job. What other skills would you say that something like this gives a child the opportunity to learn that they're not going to get in the regular system?
I think it's really comprehensive, actually, because first of all, the basics are the basics because they apply to everything. Like they are the fundamental underpinnings of everything else. So if you skip over some of the basics, and obviously it's helpful to know them first so that you don't have to be like learning basic addition and bookkeeping at the same time. But like if you've learned the basics and then you skip over and you do something applied, the basics are the underpinnings of how this applied learning is functioning. So if I have to bookkeep, I have to understand writing and spelling because I'm making lists of everything. I have to understand basic arithmetic because I'm organizing my expenses and I'm calculating like how much do I have to spend on yarn this week. But I'm also, besides the basic academic subjects that everybody is supposed to learn that are applied to it, you're also learning things that don't get covered in school, like strategic thinking and entrepreneurial thinking. Like I had to think through, if I want to see this outcome in the real world, not just in a controlled school environment, but in a place where like I was going out into the free market and these moms in my homeschool co-op were buying birthday gifts for their daughters and birthday gifts for their nieces and their friends' kids, and they could buy literally anything. And I had to be a competitive commodity that they wanted to purchase. So I had to think about like, how do I market my products? And I wasn't necessarily thinking about it in those terms. I was thinking, I love poring over the American Girl doll catalog. And so I'm going to make my own doll catalog because I love looking at these. So I just like assume this is how you sell dolls. But even that, like learning how to mimic the things that are already working in the real world and then innovate and build off of them. That's what every person who's doing any type of creative thinking in the marketplace is doing. And I was testing it in real time, and I was learning about marketing, the sales process. I was learning how to follow up with people about what they were, if they were interested in buying something, but they maybe hadn't closed a purchase. I was learning how to write receipts. I was learning how to set reasonable deadlines within which I thought I could fulfill an order and then following through on that. I was learning about time management. I was learning all of these different, both practical skills, but also mechanisms of thinking that you don't learn in school because you're never applying what you're learning. And even when you are applying what you're learning, it's usually inside of a very controlled, very artificial context. So you're not getting all of the real world pulls and pushes on, like the incentives just aren't there.
Yeah.
And so I was learning not only how to think in all of these different ways, but I also was learning how to see the through lines between the academic subjects I had already learned and their usage in the real world, which again, a lot of kids aren't getting. So I saw the benefit of arithmetic because I was using it for something that I was highly motivated to be successful at because I wanted to buy more yarn. And theoretically, I wanted to buy other things too, but I never got that far because I spent all the money on yarn. But like theoretically, I wanted to make a bunch of money doing this and buy, I don't know, something. I would have figured it out, I'm sure. But I was highly motivated for my math to be correct and for it to be something that I could pull out at the turn of a dime and, do back of the envelope calculations. If I sell this many dolls, I can buy this many books or whatever. And you're never getting that inside of a schooling environment. And that's so important because at the end of the day, you're not just learning the times table so you can rattle them off when somebody asks you what's 9 times 7. You're learning them so that they can do things for you in the real world. So understanding the context is actually the most important part. And it's the part we usually skip.
Right. So what kind of parents come to you at Rebel Educator? What kind of questions do they have? What problems? What are they worried about? Are they trying to figure out what kind of school to put their kid in? Or are they looking for ways to homeschool, or is it just across the board?
It's definitely across the board. I think the segment of my audience that's parents, which is the largest segment. Like I also have a lot of teachers in my audience. I have a lot of entrepreneurs. I have a lot of what I call aspiring parents. So they don't have kids yet, but they, hope to someday, and they're interested in learning about all of this. But of the parents in my audience, I think there are a couple categories that, like, there are lots of categories, but I think that there are a couple like primary categories. One is parents who already have their kids in some alternative program or system, and they're looking for support, but they're also looking for like reaffirmation that they're on a path that's going to work. It's very hard to deviate from the norm. It's very scary. It takes a really big toll to do something that's different from all of the other people in your world. And to have to justify what you're doing in the face of scrutiny from people who just like really don't understand, or maybe they do understand, but they're just not as comfortable as you are stepping off a status quo path. So I think that is important for parents to have a community to come back to. Or it's like, okay, there are lots of parents here who are also doing this. We can't all be crazy. Or if we're all crazy, like at least we all like understand we're all being crazy for the same reasons. So that's one subset. Another subset, and this is a pretty significant portion of the audience, is parents who are looking for alternatives and they just don't know where to start. And I think at the end of the day, that's probably the audience that I'm most trying to tailor what I'm doing to. Like parents who are looking for, like, sometimes they don't even know what. They know that they don't want their kids inside of the status quo system. It's not working. And they're trying to figure out like, what is next? Do I send them to some type of alternative school? Do I start a school? Do I homeschool them? If there are other schools in my area, how do I find them? How do I know what I'm looking at? How do I assess the potential value, the potential value or lack thereof of these different schools? I spend a lot of time having conversations with parents, especially on Twitter, who are looking for something other than the status quo. And my hope is to make it as easy as possible for them to understand, here's what's out here. It looks really complicated, but I promise it's not. Here's the handful of like sort of mental models that you need to be using to think through what you value, what's important, what you are and are not willing to spend or concede on different options. And then based on that, like, here are the handful that actually might be a fit for you. And then here's a set of questions that you want to ask of each one to kind of figure out like which one feels like the best fit for your family and your child.
You're like, it's sort of like a midwife for education of a child. Like, you're like that. You're kind of it's so interesting to have that kind of support. And I would be in that category, by the way, of aspirational parent. And just knowing that like, oh, there's this third party off the grid support system that I can talk to that is going to care about what I'm looking for. That's not a part of the public education system and that thinks outside of the box. I love it. I love what you're doing. What would you say are some of the biggest challenges that these parents are facing? I mean, obviously, I think for some of them, I would guess budget
Yeah,
or
budget is definitely a big one. It's been an interesting couple years around that conversation specifically because there's the big school choice push across the
Mhm.
country. People are really, really pushing for it. Um, I saw somebody share data recently that somebody conducted a study and like 73% of participants were in favor of school choice. Like it's a pretty overwhelming majority of the American population wants this to happen. Um, and so that's made the conversation around cost interesting because suddenly it's theoretically attainable
Mhm.
for people in entire states to be able to afford something other than status quo, um, which that really changes the conversation. But it's not just cost because even in states where school choice is passed, there are tons of parents who just like don't know what to do with it. They don't know how to access the money. They don't know how to choose what option to put the money towards. They have multiple options in their area and they don't know where to start. Um, I think a lot of people, there's this really weird phenomenon, and I'm sure you have talked about something very similar to this in many different capacities on the show before. But there's this very strange phenomenon where even if everybody kind of collectively knows that the status quo is broken and not working, or maybe it's working exactly as intended in the case of the school system, but it's like not beneficial. It's not as
Right.
you want to be putting your kids through. There's still this perceived legacy effect where it's broken, but it's still safe because it is the status quo.
It's
And
what's
going
known. It's the
Yes,
demon you know.
yes. And stepping away from that and into the uncharted territory that is anything else is still higher risk than sticking with a thing that you know isn't working, but it's sort of like a quantifiable evil.
Girl, I have talked about this on the show numerous times because there are so many times I've said, you know, people tend to get stuck in bad relationships, bad jobs, a bad habit or addiction, or just I had never really thought about a schooling choice, but put that in the category, bad schooling choice, because they know it. And even if they have problems with it, it's what they know. And the fear of the unknown, it's like this psychological block for so many of us of, but what's out there in the great unknown? And I'll say to people in my experience, those few times I've had to do the unknown thing, to get out of a toxic situation or habit or relationship or job or what, and jump into the unknown. It's scary as it's so scary. It's so risky, like you said, because you don't know what's out there in the dark waters, right? You know what this is, but once you get out there, every single time, at least in my experience, it's been worth it. You get
And
through that
it's
fear and you get to the other side.
and it's so much less scary than you thought it was going to be
Yes.
most of
Yes.
the time.
Yeah, and you look back and you're like, "Why was that so scary? Why was that so hard to end that thing?" I think
Yeah,
that's a common human thing.
it's like you're inside of a brightly lit house and for whatever reason it's terrible to be there, but you look outside and it's very dark because it's night and you think, "Wow, it's so dark out there. I can't see a thing. Surely it is not safe to go out there." But then you go through the door, you step outside, your eyes adjust to the dark very quickly and you're like, "Oh, like it's not
It's
light out here, but I can like there's a moon. I can see what's going on. Like it's not
yeah,
so bad and you can find your way to wherever it is that you want to go." When you're on the inside and you're blinded by the situation that you are currently in, everything else seems even darker and more ominous than it actually is
yes.
because like your eyes are adjusted to what is in your periphery and everything else is just like other. And that's really scary. That's really hard. It is And there's this weird social construct too, where you have to justify to people why you took the non-status quo path, even if you were wildly successful at it. You do not have to justify to people why you stayed on the path prescribed to you, even if everybody on that path one by one is walking up to the edge of a cliff and just falling off. Like, it's like, well, we're
Yeah.
all doing it. That's what you were told to do.
Yes.
So like, you don't have to answer questions about why you stayed on the path. It's just the default. But if you step off the conveyor belt and you go build a multi-million-dollar business, which is, like, people do it. And these are always the examples that people hold up. And it's like, well, if you drop out of college, you're either going to live under a bridge or you're going to be Steve Jobs, and there's no middle ground. Like, most of us are in the middle ground. But take even that type of example. You still have to answer when people ask, but why did you drop out of college? Why did you drop out of high school? Like, how did you
You've
know
had to
this was
answer
going to
that.
work? You have to answer it all the time. People, like, as a society, it's the thing that is left in question. And so I think that's really real for people, that they're looking for options and they know what exists is terrible, but they don't know how to guarantee that something other than will not only be less terrible, but will be less terrible to an extent that makes it worth the social pressures that come
Yes.
along with doing something other than. And so it's really hard. People look at all these different options for schools and they go, well, the public school system, my local public school is terrible. It's my kids not learning anything. They're miserable. They're getting bullied. They're understaffed. My kids being forced through academic subjects that they're not ready for, or maybe they already
Or they're
know,
being
but the rest of the
indoctrinated.
class, the
Yeah.
rest of the class already knows it. So, or like
Yeah.
doesn't know it yet. So they just have to sit through it. They're teaching things that I don't agree with. And I see these 3 other schools that are within driving distance and maybe even are in our price range, but I don't know how to, like, they don't fit. Excuse me. Sorry. They don't fit inside my mental model of
what
how I know how to assess a school. So I don't know if I send my kid to this weird hippie school called the Wildflowers, like hill school, whatever. And my kids, like, it's a micro school. So it's like a mixed age environment and they're hanging out with kids of all different age levels and there aren't structured class times. Like, how do I measure that and know if my kid's going to be okay coming out of that? I think a lot of parents get tripped up on that.
Yeah. So it sounds like a lot of what you do is just helping people to think about things differently.
Yeah.
One of the things I heard you talk about that I absolutely loved was childlike joy and wonder at the world. And it's funny because it's strange in the past few years how often I will hear different people from different areas of my life talking about something kind of similar. My pastor just gave a sermon where he was talking about adults losing sometimes that childlike wonder for creation, for the natural world. And I was wondering if you could talk just a little bit about how innovating your child's education, maybe choosing that path that's not the status quo, gives room for more of that childlike joy, creativity, etc.
Yeah, I think that's a phenomenal question. First of all, before I answer your question directly, I think it's really important to accentuate childlike wonder is a thing that should be valued. Like, why is this a thing that we should be going out of our way to preserve? I think there are a couple answers to that question. One is just from a quality of life standpoint. Life is much more fun when you are in a state of wonder experiencing it. Like, you can be on a hike and you can be like, yeah, there are flowers, so what? Or you can be, oh my gosh, there are flowers. I did this week. I was on a hike with a bunch of friends and there were wildflowers along the trail and it's the middle of November. And I am not from Texas. I did not know that wildflowers were still blooming. Like, they start blooming in March and they are still blooming in mid-November.
Were they
And
the
all my
yellow
friends
ones?
yes, they were beautiful. And my friends were just, hiking along the trail. And I was like, sorry, like, I'll catch up with you in a minute. Like, I have to go look at these wildflowers and like take a picture of them and examine them, because I didn't know that we had those here in November. And I was just so excited about it because they were beautiful.
Mhm.
It was like you walk along the trail and it's either, very mundane, or it is full of wonders. And which reality would you rather be living in? Like,
Yes.
you don't want to be so distracted by the wonders that you can't get anything done. You don't want to be a 2-year-old who's so excited by everything along the trail that it takes an hour to walk 100 yards. You need to be able to integrate the information in a way where you can be functional in the world and actually accomplish things in a linear and goal-oriented fashion, not just be distracted by every wonder you come across. But you don't want to be so integrated that everything that is wondrous is boring to you, because
Yeah. That
then
you take
where
it
is
for
the fun in
granted.
life? Exactly. But also there's a very practical benefit to this too. So my sense of wonder is very tied to my sense of curiosity. So I did not go down this rabbit hole when I was hiking, because there were other rabbit holes I was more interested at the time. But that could have sparked an entire rabbit hole of inquiry around, like, well, what else is like in season this time of year? And like, what are the different gradients across the country of like where different flowers bloom at different times of year? And like, how does that impact how
I
we
have
like,
been down the wildflower rabbit hole, and let me tell you, as someone who's not from Texas, when you start looking at it, there are some amazing wildflower names here, like, Indian blanket,
that was the
M
first one that was coming to my mind too when you said
Mexican hat,
that. Yeah.
Mexican hat flower. And the more you read about the flower names, the more it's like, wow, a lot of these are really, the woke people would be really upset. Like, they're so
Yes.
descriptive, but they're so perfectly descriptive. Yes, that flower looks like an Indian blanket when you have a bunch of them in a field.
Mhm. And the Mexican hat really does look like a Mexican hat. Yes, they're beautifully descriptive. They'll probably come after the wildflower names
Yeah,
eventually.
they will.
Hopefully
They
they
came after bird names already, so, okay, sorry I interrupted you. Continue.
Well, no, but this is the kind of sidetrack, like, rabbit hole that I'm talking about, where you don't know where your curiosity is gonna lead you. And
Right,
sometimes it's just for funsies. Like, we talk about wildflower names and it's just fun, but like, you have no idea where that's going to take you.
right.
Like, we could have kept going down this rabbit hole that you just brought up and ended up in some like philosophical, rabbit hole talking about the nuances of like renaming things and preserving traditions and like who
Mhm.
knows. And the sense of wonder is like every great creator, every great innovator has had it in spades. You listen to I brought up Steve Jobs as an example earlier, so I'll reference him again. If you listen to, he did some really great interviews about his childhood and his education. When you hear him talk about the things that he found interesting, like, he was fascinated by different types of radios when he was a kid, and like disassembling them and studying their anatomy and putting them back together again and understanding how to build them and make them do different things. And that inclination to tinker and experiment and explore was a fundamental part of his ability to create new things and be an innovator and a builder who created multiple technologies that we just take for granted now,
Mm.
but were completely unprecedented at the time of their creation. And one of the fundamental ingredients to being able to do that is a sense of wonder. Like, every person who has been a creative of some type, a thinker, a builder, an innovator, an artist, they all have this sense of wonder. And so when we crush it from our kids, we eliminate their capacity to be those things. When we take away the sense of wonder, you take away the capacity to be anything other than someone who plays with the world as it already exists. You
Mm.
take away the capacity to make it anything other than what it already is, which is very good for being a factory worker. It's very bad for being much of anything else. And because the education system, like, it's pretty ominous when you go through the literature of the people who actually created the education system. They talk at length about how they don't want a populace that's too creative. because they have enough
Wow.
creatives anyway from like the elite class who are going to private schools that are structured differently. And like, it's really just a distraction from all of the problems in the day-to-day that people have to be struggling with if they're like too interested in poetry. Like if you're too interested in poetry, you're not
Yeah.
going to be very useful at the mill. So like why would we teach people this thing that's actually going to detract from their capacity to be, you know, a useful and productive part of society?
Isn't that so telling? Like,
It
why
is.
does a farm animal need poetry?
Mhm.
That's
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah, it's very telling, but when you preserve that sense of wonder, you preserve your child's potential to be creative in some capacity. What they choose to do with that, that's also a creative endeavor. Who knows? They might do something with it, they might not, but they have the potential still alive within them. And preserving a sense of wonder is actually quite easy. Like, it's destroying it that takes work. If you just leave it alone and you encourage it, it'll take care of itself. Like, if you just let it be and you create space for the wildflower that is your child to just like run wild and grow in whatever unruly and strange ways that it wants. If you just like leave enough room for that to happen, it's going to grow on its own. And if you encourage it by asking it questions or, you know, engaging in conversation or providing resources that feed into the curiosities, that's even better. But really what requires the work is cutting it off, which we have a system that does a great job at that, but
Yeah.
it has to make an effort to stifle the wonder. It doesn't go away on its own.
I I'm fascinated by what you do. I love talking with you, and I'm just very grateful that you could be here today. I was wondering if I don't wanna keep you too long, so,
Mhm.
we usually go about an hour for interviews. I was wondering if you have time to just leave us with some advice for parents. Anybody who may be listening or anybody who got sent this video and are navigating their child's education, or if they're aspirational parents and they're wondering
Mhm.
about what they're gonna do. What are some of the key takeaways for them?
Yeah, I think I always tell parents, like, trust your own instincts, trust your own intuitions, trust the things that you sense are like places to lean into and push into in terms of finding information or advocating for your kid. Trust the things that don't feel like a fit too. Um, there are a lot of uh, self-proclaimed and system-proclaimed experts out there who are going to tell you a lot of different things about what is and isn't good or right for your kid. And like, people have expertise for a reason. Like, you know, there are a lot of people that it is healthy to listen to and to who have useful insights about childhood development and different things that are, you know, actually beneficial for your kid to learn, but run all of them through your own filter of you know your kid and you have instincts about your kid, and those are important too. Um, if you're looking for something other than, or even just looking to supplement the status quo with your kids, I have tons and tons of resources. So if you're on Twitter, that is the place that I am most active and is the place that is easiest to reach me. You can find my personal Twitter is at Hannah Frankman, and that will link to Rebel Educator, or you can just find at Rebel Educator. I also spend a lot of time on Instagram. I don't know where your audience normally lives. I've started building an Instagram recently with the launch of the podcast a few months ago. That's also that one's at Hannah Frankman Podcast. Um, so you can check that out on Instagram as well. And then, um, like Keri mentioned earlier, I also have a podcast. So if you enjoyed this conversation and want to keep going down the rabbit hole, once in a while I have a wild card episode that's just somebody I find interesting talking about something that has nothing to do with education. Like, I had one of my friends on who's a geneticist a couple months ago, and we just spent 2 hours talking about the genetics of redheads because I had a lot of questions. I was like, please explain all my weird quirks and tell me which ones of these I can blame on my hair color and which ones I can't. Um, but most of the conversations are about education. I had an episode, my very first episode actually was with my friend Connor Boyack, who writes the Tuttle Twins books series.
Oh, I've heard of the Tuttle Twins.
Yeah, Connor's great. And we talked extensively about homeschooling on that one, and he had a lot of really great insights. So I would recommend that one. And then a few weeks ago, I had my friend Steve Lane on the podcast. And he's not an education guy. He works in like alternative health and like holistic health and wellness.
Okay.
But he is homeschooling his kids. He has a lot of thoughts on the intersections between health and wellness and education. And so it was a phenomenal conversation. He just dropped so much wisdom. So if like the sense of wonder stuff that we're talking about resonates, I would recommend listening to the episode with C too as a starting point, because there was just a lot of gold in that episode that relates to the conversation that we just had. But I have tons of stuff on the show people can check out. And you can always DM me on Instagram and Twitter too. My DMs are open. I'm always happy to chat.
A lot of the knitters are on Instagram to answer where do they hang out.
Amazing.
The gamers are more on Twitter. But you guys check out the links below. We have everything that Hannah just mentioned linked below, including those 2 specific episodes. And go give her a follow and give her some knitter love, some wrong knitter love. Thank you so much, Hannah, for being here with us. And I like I said, I love what you're doing. I want to stay in touch. I want to see what else you're working on, especially that you're local. That is so exciting that someone like you is here in Texas. So I'm just really grateful that you're out there doing what you do. So thank you for stopping by Deprogram.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Take care.